The boring daily life of a Cuban cigar roller. The sun hasn't yet risen over the valley when Miguel opens his eyes. It's still dark outside his modest wooden home, but his body knows the rhythm. It's 4:30 in the morning, the same time he's woken for the past 23 years. In the 1920s, in the tobacco towns surrounding Havana, a cigar roller's day begins before dawn. He moves slowly, carefully, so as not to wake his wife and 3 children sleeping in the next room. The floorboards creak softly under his feet, a sound as familiar as his own breathing. In the small kitchen, he lights a single candle and prepares café cubano in a battered tin pot, the rich aroma filling the quiet space. This moment of solitude is sacred to him. By 5:30, Miguel is walking down the unpaved road toward the factory. His leather satchel, worn smooth from years of use, contains his lunch, typically bread, cheese, and whatever fruit his wife could spare. The walk takes exactly 17 minutes. He knows this because he's counted, many times, on mornings when his mind wandered. The tabaquería, the cigar factory, is a 3-story building with tall windows designed to capture the early morning light. Miguel was apprenticed here at age 13, spending his first 2 years doing nothing but stripping stems from tobacco leaves. His fingers bled in those early months, the tobacco oils stinging the small cuts until his skin finally toughened. The apprenticeship system was strict and unforgiving. Most young boys spent at least 5 to 7 years learning the craft before they were permitted to roll their first complete cigar. Inside, the workshop is already stirring with quiet activity. The torcedors, the cigar rollers, arrive between 5:30 and 6, each taking their place at the same station they've occupied for years. Miguel's bench is third from the window on the left side. The smooth wooden surface bears the indentations of countless cigars rolled across its face, a topography of labor. The factory foreman, Don Esteban, a severe man with silver hair and tobacco-stained fingers, walks between the rows as the men settle in. He's checking that everyone is present, that the tools are in order. Each roller has their own chaveta, a flat, semicircular blade used to cut the tobacco leaves with precision. Miguel's chaveta belonged to his father before him, the wooden handle polished to a deep shine by 2 generations of palms. At precisely 6 o'clock, as the first rays of sunlight angle through the tall windows, the work begins in earnest. But before the hands start moving, before the first leaf is selected, there's a moment Miguel has always treasured. The lector takes his seat. On an elevated platform at the front of the room sits Rafael, the factory reader. Since the 1860s, Cuban cigar factories had employed lectors to read aloud to the workers while they rolled. Rafael opens today's newspaper first, his clear voice carrying across the silent workshop as he reads about distant events in Europe, about sugar prices, about a ship that arrived in Havana harbor. Later, he'll turn to literature. They're currently making their way through a novel by Alexander Dumas, 15 or 20 pages each day. Miguel reaches for his first leaf of the day. The tobacco has been aging in the factory's climate-controlled warehouse for at least 2 years, some of the premium leaves for 5 or even 6 years. The foreman selects which leaves each roller will use based on their skill level and the type of cigar being produced. Miguel, as a senior torcedor, works with some of the finest leaves in the factory. The leaf feels cool and slightly moist in his hands. The humidity in the rolling room is carefully maintained at around 70% to keep the tobacco pliable. He examines it with eyes that have studied thousands upon thousands of leaves, looking for the veins, the color variations, the subtle imperfections that will determine how he uses it. His hands begin to move with a rhythm learned over decades, selecting the tripa, the filler leaves that form the cigar's core. 3 different types of tobacco will blend in the center, one for flavor, one for aroma, one for the burn rate. He arranges them with unconscious precision, the way a musician's fingers find their notes. Around him, 30 other men work in similar silence, their hands performing the same ancient choreography. The only sounds are Raphael's voice, steady and clear, reading about a count's betrayal, and the soft whisper of tobacco leaves being shaped, the gentle tap of the chaveta against wood. This is how the day unfolds, hour after quiet hour, in a rhythm as old as the craft itself. By 8 o'clock, Miguel has completed his first bundle of cigars, 25 in total, each one identical to the last. They rest in a neat row on the wooden tray beside his bench, waiting for the inspector's examination. In the factories of this era, a skilled torcedor like Miguel is expected to produce between 100 and 150 cigars per day, depending on the size and complexity of the ring gauge. Don Esteban approaches with his measuring tools, a small metal ring gauge and a scale so precise it can detect the difference of a single leaf. He slides the gauge over each cigar, checking that the diameter is exact from head to foot. Miguel watches without anxiety. In all his years, he's rarely had a cigar rejected. But some of the younger rollers, those still in their first decade of work, shift nervously when the inspector approaches their stations. A rejected cigar means lost time, lost wages. The rollers are paid by the piece, not by the hour. The morning stretches on. Raphael's voice continues its steady cadence. The count has fled into the night, pursued by enemies. Miguel's hands continue their work. Select the filler. Arrange it. Roll the capote, the binder leaf that holds the filler together. His movements are so practiced that his mind can wander while his hands maintain their precision. He thinks about his oldest son, about whether the boy should follow him into this trade or seek something different. At 10 o'clock, a young boy appears, no more than 8 years old, barefoot, carrying a tin bucket. This is the aguador, the water boy, making his rounds through the workshop. Miguel accepts a small cup of water, drinks it in 3 slow sips, and returns to his work. The factory provides water twice each morning and twice each afternoon. In the heat of the Cuban day, even with the windows open, the workshop grows warm. The leaves in front of him are Vuelta a Bajo tobacco, grown in the Pinar del Rio region west of Havana. This region's red soil and unique microclimate produce what many consider the finest cigar tobacco in the world. Miguel has never been to Pinar del Rio himself, it's nearly 100 miles away, but he knows the tobacco intimately. He can identify Vuelta a Bajo leaves by touch, by scent, by the way they respond to his hands. He reaches now for the capa, the wrapper leaf, the final and most delicate layer. This is the cigar's face, what the smoker will see and touch, and it must be flawless. A single wrapper leaf is cut from the tobacco plant's upper primings, where the leaves grow largest and smoothest. One wrapper leaf might be large enough to cover 6 or 7 cigars, but Miguel must cut it carefully, avoiding any visible veins or discoloration. He lays the wrapper leaf on his cutting board and takes up his chaveta. The blade moves in a smooth arc, guided by decades of muscle memory. The piece he cuts is roughly rectangular, tapering slightly at one end. He places the already rolled bunch of filler and binder onto the wrapper at a precise angle, 45 degrees, always 45 degrees, and begins to roll. This is the moment that separates a master from an apprentice. The wrapper must be drawn tight enough to provide structure, but not so tight that the cigar won't draw properly when smoked. It must spiral along the cigar's length at an exact angle, creating a smooth, even surface. Miguel's fingers press and guide the wrapper leaf as it winds upward, and he can feel through his fingertips whether the tension is correct. At the cigar's head, he forms the cap, a small circular piece of wrapper leaf that seals the end. He applies a tiny amount of natural gum arabic, a plant-based adhesive that's been used in cigar making since the earliest days. The cap must be smooth and invisible, as if it's part of the same continuous wrapper. His thumb smooths the final edge, and it's done. Another cigar joins the row on his tray. Rafael has finished the day's section of Dumas and has moved on to reading from El Mundo, one of Havana's daily newspapers. He reads an article about tobacco exports, about how Cuban cigars are prized in America and Europe, about the negotiations between factory owners and the workers' union. Miguel listens with half an ear. He's not a political man, but he knows the union has fought for better conditions, for the right to keep their lectors when some factory owners wanted to remove them to increase productivity. The workshop continues its quiet rhythm. 30 men, hands moving, leaves rustling, Rafael's voice rising and falling with the drama of the news and stories. Outside the tall windows, the sun climbs higher. In the street below, horse-drawn carts clatter past, vendors call out their wares, life proceeds in its chaotic way. But here, inside these walls, time moves differently, measured not in minutes but in cigars, in the steady accumulation of perfectly rolled tobacco. Miguel glances at the clock on the far wall. 11:30. In another 30 minutes, the bell will ring for the midday meal, and the workshop will empty as the men take their lunch in the courtyard or under the shade of the ceiba trees outside. But for now, there is only this, his hands, the tobacco, the quiet satisfaction of work done well. He reaches for another leaf, and begins again. The bell rings at noon, a single, clear note that echoes through the workshop. Miguel sets down his chaveta and stretches his fingers, feeling the familiar stiffness in his knuckles. He's been working for 6 hours without pause, and his hands have rolled 43 cigars. The men rise from their benches in near silence, a quiet shuffling of feet and the scrape of chairs against the wooden floor. Outside, in the factory courtyard, Miguel finds his usual spot beneath the sprawling branches of an old ceiba tree. The shade is deep and cool here, a relief from the morning's growing heat. He unwraps the cloth bundle his wife prepared. Today it's pan cubano with thin slices of pork and a small mango, slightly overripe but sweet. The lunch break lasts exactly 1 hour, from noon until 1 o'clock, and most of the men use this time to eat, smoke, and rest their eyes. Miguel notices that several of the rollers have brought their own cigars, not the fine export quality they produce in the factory, but simpler puros they've rolled at home from their weekly allotment. Each torcedor is permitted to take home a small quantity of tobacco scraps and imperfect leaves each week, a tradition that factory owners have honored for generations. These scraps, called picadura, are the remnants left over from cutting wrapper leaves, or leaves with minor blemishes unsuitable for premium cigars. From these, the rollers craft their own smokes. He watches as old Tomas lights one of his home-rolled cigars, the smoke curling upward into the ceiba's branches. Tomas has been rolling for 42 years, he started when he was 12, and now his hair is white and his back is bent. But his hands, Miguel notices, are still steady. A master roller's career could span 4 decades or more, their fingers maintaining their precision long after the rest of their body had begun to fail. The conversation around him is sparse and unhurried. Someone mentions the upcoming San Juan festival. Another speaks of his daughter's upcoming wedding. These men spend 10 hours a day together, 6 days a week, and there's a comfortable silence between them that doesn't require filling. Miguel finishes his mango and wipes his hands on his trousers. At 1 o'clock, the bell rings again, and the men file back inside. The afternoon shift begins exactly as the morning did. Rafael takes his seat and opens a book of poetry by José Martí. His voice fills the workshop with verses about palm trees and freedom, about the Cuban countryside and longing for home. The words wash over Miguel as his hands return to their work. The afternoon tobacco feels different from the morning's leaves. The heat has risen, and even with the carefully maintained humidity, Miguel can sense a slight change in how the wrapper responds to his touch. He adjusts without thinking, applying fractionally less pressure, working with the tobacco rather than against it. This sensitivity to subtle changes, how temperature, humidity, even the time of day affects the leaves, is something that cannot be taught. It comes only from years of intimate contact with tobacco, from rolling thousands upon thousands of cigars until the knowledge lives in the hands themselves. By 3 o'clock, Miguel has reached his 75th cigar of the day. His pace has remained steady throughout. Each cigar takes approximately 6 to 8 minutes from the first selection of filler to the final smoothing of the cap. The mathematics of it is simple: 8 minutes per cigar, 75 cigars, 600 minutes of work. But the reality is more complex. Some cigars flow from his hands in 5 minutes, others demand 10 or 12 when the leaves are difficult or when his concentration wavers. Don Esteban makes his afternoon rounds, this time checking not just the finished cigars but also watching the technique. He pauses behind young Carlos, a torcedor in his 3rd year of independent rolling. Miguel can hear the foreman's low voice offering correction: the wrapper is too loose at the foot. Feel here, you see? The draw will be uneven. This is how knowledge passes down, from master to journeyman, the same way it's been done for 100 years. The factory operates on a strict hierarchy. At the bottom are the apprentices, who earn almost nothing while they learn. Above them are the journeyman rollers, those who've completed their training but haven't yet achieved mastery. Then come the master torcedors like Miguel, trusted with the finest tobacco and the most difficult sizes. At the very top of the rolling hierarchy are the escogadores especials, the special selectors, master rollers who create the factory's most premium cigars, the ones destined for wealthy merchants in London and New York, for presidents and kings. Miguel has twice been offered the chance to become an escogador especial, but he declined both times. The pressure, the scrutiny, the expectation of absolute perfection, he prefers the quiet dignity of his current station. Rafael is reading now from the newspaper again, an article about a railway being built in the Orient province. Miguel half listens while his hands continue their endless motion. Select, arrange, roll, cut, wrap, seal. Select, arrange, roll, cut, wrap, seal. The rhythm is meditative, almost like a prayer. His mind drifts to the evening ahead. He'll walk home in the fading light, wash his hands in the basin by the door, eat dinner with his family. His youngest daughter will probably climb into his lap and ask him to tell her a story. But that is hours away still. For now, there is only the workshop, the tobacco, the steady accumulation of perfectly formed cigars. The afternoon light slants through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the rolling benches. Dust motes drift in the golden air. Rafael's voice continues, steady as a heartbeat. And Miguel's hands, tobacco-stained and sure, reach for another leaf. By 4 o'clock, the afternoon heat has settled into the workshop like a living thing. Even with all the windows open, even with the careful attention to humidity, the air feels thick and heavy. Miguel pauses to wipe his brow with a handkerchief, one of the few interruptions he allows himself. Around him, other rollers do the same, the white cloths appearing like scattered flags of surrender to the Cuban afternoon. The aguador makes his rounds again, and this time Miguel drinks 2 cups instead of 1. The water is lukewarm but welcome. He notices that the boy's feet are dirty, his trousers patched at the knees. The child will earn perhaps 20 centavos for a full day of carrying water, a pittance, but it's honest work and keeps him from the streets. Many of the rollers in this very workshop began their lives in the factory this way, first as water boys or errand runners, then as apprentices, gradually working their way up through the ranks. Miguel returns his attention to the cigars before him. He's working now on Coronas, a popular size, measuring approximately 5.5 inches in length with a ring gauge of 42. The factory produces a dozen different sizes and shapes, each with its own name, its own specifications, its own particular challenges. The torpedoes with their pointed heads require exceptional skill with the wrapper. The massive Presidentes, nearly 8 inches long, demand strength and endurance. But the Coronas are Miguel's specialty. He's rolled so many over the years that his hands know their dimensions without conscious thought. Don Esteban appears at his shoulder, carrying a wooden box lined with cedar. "Miguel," he says quietly, "these are for the special order. The Hotel Nacional." Miguel nods, understanding. Several of Havana's grand hotels maintain standing orders with the factory: the Hotel Nacional, the Hotel Sevilla, the Hotel Inglaterra. These cigars will be sold in hotel lobbies to wealthy tourists, American businessmen, European travelers seeking an authentic Cuban experience. They must be flawless. He selects his leaves with even greater care than usual. The wrapper must be pristine, no veins visible, no variation in color, the surface smooth as silk. These premium cigars will be placed in ornate cedar boxes, each cigar nestled in its individual space, the box labeled with gold lettering. The hotels pay 3 or 4 times the normal price for such presentation, and they expect perfection in return. Rafael has moved on from the newspaper to a novel by Cervantes, Don Quixote, a story the men have heard read aloud at least a dozen times over the years. But it doesn't matter. The familiarity is part of the comfort. Miguel knows the windmills are coming, knows the night will mistake them for giants. His hands continue rolling while his mind follows the mad hidalgo across the Spanish plains. At 5 o'clock, something unusual happens. One of the younger rollers, a man named Felipe, perhaps 25 years old, suddenly pushes back from his bench and stands. His face is flushed, his breathing rapid. Don Esteban is at his side immediately, gripping his arm, guiding him toward the door. Miguel knows what this is. He's seen it before. The tobacco sickness. For all the beauty of the craft, there's a shadow side that's rarely spoken of. The constant handling of tobacco, the oils that coat the fingers and palms, the fine dust that hangs in the air, over time, it affects some men more than others. They develop headaches, nausea, a racing heart. Some rollers build up a tolerance over years. Others, like Felipe, never fully adapt. The young man will be sent home for the rest of the day, told to rest, told to drink water and eat something substantial. Tomorrow he'll likely return, because what else can he do? This is the only trade he knows. The incident passes, and the workshop settles back into its rhythm. Miguel has seen men work for 30 years in these factories, their health slowly deteriorating from the constant exposure. He's been fortunate, his constitution is strong, and whatever afflicts some men has mostly spared him. But he knows his luck may not last forever. Every roller knows this. The light outside has begun to soften, taking on the golden quality of late afternoon. Miguel is working on his 108th cigar of the day. His fingers are tired now, the muscles in his forearms tight and sore. But there are still 2 hours remaining in the workday, and he has a quota to meet. The factory owners expect 120 cigars from a master roller in a standard 10-hour day. He'll meet that number, as he always does. He thinks about the journey these cigars will take. After rolling, they'll be placed in the factory's aging room, a climate-controlled chamber where thousands of cigars rest in tall cedar cabinets. They'll remain there for a minimum of 3 weeks, some for as long as 3 months, allowing the tobacco to marry, the flavors to meld and mature. Only after this aging period will they be sorted by color. There are as many as 65 different color gradations that professional sorters can distinguish, from the lightest claro to the darkest oscuro. The cigars must be arranged in the box so that the color transitions smoothly from one end to the other, creating a visual harmony that pleases the eye. Miguel will never see the final result of his day's work. He'll never know which wealthy gentleman lights one of his Coronas in a Havana hotel, never know if that man enjoys it or finds fault. The cigar will leave his hands, enter the aging room, be sorted and boxed, and disappear into the world. This anonymity is part of the craft. His work is unsigned, uncredited, indistinguishable from that of the other master rollers. Only the factory's name will appear on the box. Raphael's voice rises slightly as Don Quixote charges at the windmills. A few of the rollers smile. They know this passage well, can almost recite it themselves. Outside, the street vendors are beginning their evening calls, selling fritas and tamales to workers heading home from other trades. But inside the workshop, there are still cigars to be rolled, still leaves waiting to be shaped. Miguel's hands reach for the next bundle of filler tobacco. The day is not yet done. At 5:30, Miguel feels the familiar ache settling deep into his lower back. He's been sitting on the same wooden stool for nearly 11 hours, with only the brief lunch respite. The stools in the factory are deliberately simple, backless, unpadded, designed to keep the rollers upright and attentive to their work. Some of the older men bring small cushions from home, tucked discreetly beneath them, but Miguel has never allowed himself this comfort. Pride, perhaps. Or stubbornness. He shifts his weight slightly and continues working. The cigar in his hands is destined for the factory's second-tier line, still quality work, but not the premium selection. These will be sold in Havana's smaller tobacco shops, or shipped to provincial towns across Cuba where the merchants and local officials purchase their daily smokes. Even these lesser cigars demand precision, demand care. A poorly rolled cigar doesn't simply fail to satisfy, it reflects badly on the roller's honor, on the factory's reputation, on the entire tradition of Cuban tobacco. Don Esteban walks past carrying a ledger book, his pen scratching as he tallies the day's production. Each roller's output is meticulously recorded, not merely the quantity, but also the number of cigars rejected during inspection, the types and sizes completed, any materials wasted. At the end of each week, on Saturday afternoon, the rollers receive their wages based on these careful calculations. A master roller like Miguel might earn 8 to 10 pesos per week, enough to support his family modestly, to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. It's more than a field worker earns, less than a merchant makes, somewhere in the middle of Cuba's complex economic ladder. Raphael has set aside Cervantes and picked up a political pamphlet. His voice takes on a different tone now, more urgent, as he reads about workers' rights, about the growing labor movement across the island. Miguel listens more carefully to this than to the novels. There's been talk recently of strikes, of demands for better wages and shorter hours. The torcedors' union has grown stronger over the past decade, and some of the younger rollers speak openly about challenging the factory owners. Miguel himself is uncertain. He values stability, fears the disruption a strike might bring. But he also knows that his father earned nearly the same wages 30 years ago, while the cost of rice and beans has steadily climbed. The tobacco in front of him is running low. He raises his hand slightly, a subtle gesture, and within moments one of the factory assistants appears with a fresh supply. The tobacco is brought to the rollers throughout the day from the warehouse below, where enormous quantities are stored in carefully monitored conditions. The warehouse holds tobacco from multiple harvests, some from this year, some from 2 or 3 years past, some even older. The master blenders in the factory determine which leaves will be combined for each line of cigars, selecting tobacco from different years in different fields to achieve the desired flavor profile. Miguel examines the new leaves before him. These are slightly darker than the morning's tobacco, with a richer, oilier texture. Maduro wrappers, harvested from the lower primings of the plant and aged longer to develop their dark color and stronger flavor. Working with Maduro requires a different touch. The leaves are more delicate despite their appearance, prone to tearing if handled roughly. He adjusts his technique accordingly, his fingers gentler, more patient. The workshop has grown quieter as the day wears on. The conversations during the morning break have long since faded. The men are tired, their focus narrowed to the work before them. Even Raphael's voice seems softer now, though perhaps that's merely Miguel's imagination. Don Quixote has been defeated by the Knight of the White Moon, forced to renounce his quest and return home. There's a melancholy to this section that seems to match the mood of the late afternoon. At 6:15, Miguel completes his 120th cigar. He's met his quota with 45 minutes remaining in the workday. He could stop now, some rollers do, once they've reached their number. But Miguel continues. Each additional cigar beyond the quota earns the same piece rate payment, and his family can always use the extra centavos. Besides, his hands know no other way to be. To sit idle while others work would feel strange, uncomfortable, like wearing another man's shoes. He glances down the row of benches and sees old Tomas still working, his white head bent over his rolling board. Tomas must be nearly 60 now, Miguel calculates. In a few more years, perhaps, his hands will fail him completely, the arthritis that already gnarls his knuckles finally making the delicate work impossible. There's no pension for factory workers, no provision for old age. When a roller can no longer roll, he must rely on his children, or on charity, or on whatever small savings he's managed to set aside from decades of wages. Miguel pushes the thought away. He's only 46. He has years yet before he must face such concerns. The light through the windows has turned amber, the sun settling toward the horizon. Shadows stretch long across the workshop floor. Miguel can hear the evening sounds of the city beyond, church bells ringing the 6:30 hour, the whistle of a train in the distance, children's voices calling to one another in the street. His own children will be waiting for him at home. His wife will have kept his dinner warm. But for now, there's another leaf to wrap, another cigar to complete. His hands move with the same precision they've maintained all day, selecting the wrapper, positioning it, beginning the spiral. The tobacco yields to his touch, taking shape, becoming something more than dried leaves. Each cigar is a small act of transformation, of bringing order and purpose to raw material. After 23 years, this still gives him a quiet satisfaction. Raphael closes his book. He'll read one final piece before the day ends, a poem, perhaps, or a brief news item. Something to carry the men through the last minutes of work. His voice fills the workshop one more time, and Miguel listens while his hands continue their ancient dance. The day is almost done. Soon the bell will ring, releasing them all back to their separate lives. But that moment hasn't arrived yet, and so Miguel does what he's always done, he reaches for another leaf, and he begins again. At 6:45, Don Esteban makes his final rounds through the workshop. He carries with him a small wooden box, inside are the anillas, the paper bands that will eventually encircle the finished cigars. Miguel catches a glimpse of them as the foreman passes, ornate designs printed in gold and crimson, depicting pastoral scenes, coats of arms, the factory's name in elegant script. These bands are printed in specialized shops in Havana, some even imported from lithographers in Germany or France, where the printing techniques produce colors more vivid than any Cuban press can achieve. The bands themselves tell a story of marketing and prestige. 30 years ago, Miguel's father told him, cigars had no bands at all. The tradition began in Europe, where cigar manufacturers started wrapping their products with decorative paper rings to distinguish their brand from competitors and to protect gentlemen smokers' white gloves from tobacco stains. Now every factory has its own distinctive design, and collectors in faraway cities keep albums of these tiny paper rings, cataloging them like rare stamps. Miguel will never touch these bands himself. That task belongs to a different set of workers, the aniladores, mostly women, who sit in a separate room and apply the delicate paper rings to each cigar with swift, precise movements. It's considered unsuitable work for the male rollers, this decorative finishing. The divide is absolute: men roll, women band and sort. Miguel has worked in this factory for over 2 decades and has never set foot in the banding room. He finishes his 128th cigar and adds it to his final tray. His hands are dark with tobacco residue, the creases in his palms stained brown. Tonight he'll scrub them with a rough bar of soap, and still the stain will remain, worked so deep into the skin that it's become permanent. Every torcedor carries these marks. They're a badge of the trade, visible proof of a life spent working with tobacco. Rafael stands and stretches, rolling his shoulders. The lector has been sitting and reading for 10 hours as well, his voice growing hoarse toward the end of the day. He's paid differently than the rollers, not by the piece, but a weekly salary funded by contributions from the workers themselves. Each torcedor pays a few centavos from his wages every week to maintain the reader's position. The factory owners tolerate this arrangement, though some grumble about the time spent listening rather than working. But the rollers know better. The reading makes the hours bearable, transforms monotonous labor into something almost bearable. Without Rafael's voice, the silence would be crushing. The factory operates year-round, but there are rhythms to the work that Miguel has learned to read. The months from January through April are the busiest. This is when the previous year's tobacco harvest has been properly aged and is ready for rolling, and when demand from Europe and North America peaks as wealthy customers prepare for spring and summer. During these months, the factory sometimes extends the workday by an extra hour, and the rollers arrive even earlier to meet the increased production demands. Conversely, the late summer and early autumn months are slower. August and September see reduced orders, and sometimes the factory operates only 4 or 5 days per week instead of 6. Miguel dreads these slow periods. Less work means less pay, and his family budget allows for little flexibility. He's known rollers who seek temporary work during the slow months, loading ships at the harbor, helping with construction projects, anything to supplement their reduced wages. He himself has never done this, clinging perhaps too stubbornly to his identity as a torcedor. The bell rings at precisely 7 o'clock, a deep, resonant sound that seems to vibrate through Miguel's chest. All around him, 30 men set down their tools with audible sighs of relief. The day is done. Hands are flexed, backs stretched, eyes rubbed. Don Esteban moves through the workshop, ensuring that each man's final tray is properly labeled with his worker number, that the tobacco is covered and protected from the night air, that the tools are cleaned and stored. Miguel wipes his chaveta with a soft cloth, removing the sticky tobacco residue from the blade. This ritual is important. A well-maintained tool is essential to the work, and the chaveta must be treated with respect. Some rollers sharpen their blades every few days, maintaining an edge so fine it can split a hair. Miguel sharpens his once a week, on Sunday afternoons, sitting in his small backyard with a whetstone and a cup of coffee, the methodical scrape of metal against stone a kind of meditation. The men file out through the factory's main entrance, their footsteps echoing in the now empty space. Outside, the evening air is cooler, fresher, a relief after the day's enclosed humidity. Miguel breathes deeply, feeling his lungs expand. The street is busy with workers from other factories, other trades, all heading home at the end of their day. A vendor sells churros from a cart on the corner, and the sweet smell of fried dough and sugar mingles with the ever-present scent of tobacco that clings to Miguel's clothes. He begins his walk home, the same route he's taken for 23 years. His leather satchel is lighter now, the lunch consumed, nothing inside but an empty cloth and a small tin cup. His feet know the way without guidance, stepping over the familiar crack in the pavement near the pharmacy, turning left at the corner where the old mango tree grows. Other rollers walk nearby, men from his factory and from the competing tabaqueria 2 streets over. They nod to one another, these practitioners of the same craft, but they don't speak much. The day has exhausted their words. Tomorrow they'll begin again, the same walk in darkness, the same hours at the bench, the same precise movements repeated hundreds of times. But tonight, briefly, Miguel belongs to himself and his family. The sky above is deepening to purple, the first stars beginning to appear. Somewhere in the city, in a hotel lobby or a gentleman's club, someone is lighting a cigar that Miguel rolled. The smoke rises, dissipates, disappears. The connection between the roller's hands and the smoker's lips is invisible, unknowable, and yet it exists, a thread spanning the distance between labor and luxury, between the workshop and the wider world. Miguel turns onto his street and sees the light in his window, his wife moving past the curtain. His youngest daughter spots him and runs to the door, calling his name. He's home. The day is done. Miguel's daughter, Elena, wraps her small arms around his leg as he steps through the doorway. She's 5 years old, dark-eyed and curious, and she wrinkles her nose at the smell of tobacco that permeates his clothing. "Papa smells like the factory," she announces, and his wife, Rosa, smiles from where she stands at the small stove. "Go wash," Rosa tells him, gesturing toward the basin by the door. This is the nightly ritual. He scrubs his hands and face, removes his work shirt, puts on the clean one Rosa has laid out for him. The work clothes will be washed tomorrow, beaten against rocks at the community washing station, hung in the sun to dry. But the tobacco smell never fully leaves the fabric. It's woven into the threads as permanently as it's stained into his skin. At the small table, his 2 sons are already seated. Carlos, the eldest at 15, works as an apprentice at the same factory, though in a different section of the building. He's been there for 2 years now, still stripping stems, still learning. Miguel sees the boy's hands, younger, smoother than his own, but already developing the calluses that mark a tobacco worker. His middle son, Jorge, is 12 and still in school, though Miguel knows this won't last much longer. The family needs the income another worker would bring. Rosa sets bowls before them, potage de frijoles negros, black bean stew with rice, a small piece of pork divided among the 5 of them. It's simple food, but it's hot and filling. Miguel eats slowly, savoring each bite. In the factory, the workers are prohibited from eating at their benches. The oils from food would contaminate the tobacco, affecting its flavor and aroma. Even touching your face during work is discouraged. Some rollers go the entire 10 hours without putting anything in their mouths except water. "How many today, Papa?" Carlos asks, and Miguel tells him, 131. The boy nods, impressed. He himself managed only 200 stem strippings today, and his fingers are sore from the repetitive work. Miguel remembers those early years, remembers the way his hands would cramp and ache, the way he'd fall into bed each night too exhausted even to dream. After dinner, Miguel steps outside into the small patch of dirt behind their home. A single tobacco plant grows here in a wooden half-barrel, not for smoking, but for teaching. He's been showing Elena the parts of the plant, the broad leaves, the sticky flowers, the way the bottom leaves are thicker and darker than those at the top. The plant isn't thriving, the soil in Havana is wrong for tobacco, lacks the minerals and drainage of the Vuelta Abajo region, but it's enough for her to understand where her father's work begins. He lights one of his home-rolled cigars, the harsh smoke familiar and comforting. These personal cigars are nothing like the elegant products he creates in the factory. They're rough, uneven, rolled from leftover scraps in seconds. But there is, made by his hands in his own time, and there's a freedom in that. In the factory, every cigar belongs to the owner. Here, this smoke is his own. Rosa joins him, bringing a small cup of coffee sweetened with precious sugar. Carlos wants to become a roller, she says quietly, and Miguel nods. He's known this was coming. Don Esteban says he could move up in another year, maybe 2. If he shows promise. Miguel draws on his cigar, considering. The apprenticeship system is changing, he knows. In his father's day, boys started at 10 or 11 and spent 7 years learning. Now, with the factory owners pushing for greater efficiency, apprenticeships are sometimes shortened to 4 or 5 years. The quality suffers, the old masters complain, but the factory owners care more about production numbers than tradition. It's hard work, Miguel says finally. Harder than people think. Rosa is silent for a moment. Then, what else is there for him? It's a fair question. Cuba in the 1920s offers limited options for a working-class boy. He could labor in the cane fields, breaking his back for even less pay. He could seek work at the docks, dangerous and uncertain. He could try to apprentice in another trade, carpentry, perhaps, or metalwork, but those positions are scarce and jealously guarded. The tobacco factories, at least, employ thousands. There's always a need for skilled hands. I'll speak to Don Esteban, Miguel says. See if Carlos can begin observing the rollers during his breaks. Start learning the motions. Inside, he can hear Elena singing to herself, a children's song about a little bird. Jorge is reading by candlelight, squinting at the pages of a book borrowed from school. Miguel feels the weight of it all, the responsibility of feeding them, clothing them, giving them some chance at a life better than his own. The 10 pesos a week he earns feels both like an achievement and an impossibility. On Sundays, the factory is closed. It's the one day of rest mandated by both tradition and, more recently, by pressure from the workers' union. Miguel uses these Sundays to maintain his tools, to spend time with his family, to attend Mass at the small church 3 streets away. Rosa insists on this last part, though Miguel's faith is quiet and uncertain. He prays sometimes, but mostly he sits in the wooden pew and lets his mind rest, grateful for the silence, for the absence of Raphael's reading voice and the foreman's watchful eye. Some Sundays, there are gatherings, other factory workers meeting in someone's home or in the small plaza near the market. They talk about wages, about working conditions, about the rumors of strikes at factories in other parts of Havana. The union representatives speak passionately about workers' rights, about the dignity of labor, about standing together against the factory owners who grow wealthy from the rollers' skilled hands. Miguel attends these meetings occasionally, but he doesn't speak. He's not a political man, not a radical. He simply wants to feed his family, to do his work well, to perhaps see his children have opportunities he never had. The talk of strikes makes him nervous. He remembers the strike of 1919, how it lasted for weeks, how families went hungry, how some men lost their positions entirely when it ended. The factory owners have long memories. He finishes his cigar and grinds the stub beneath his heel. The night is fully dark now, the street quiet except for distant voices and the occasional clatter of a passing cart. Tomorrow is Saturday, a full workday, but at the end of it, there will be wages. Rosa will take the money and divide it carefully, so much for rent, so much for food, a few centavos saved if possible for emergencies or for the boy's future. Miguel returns inside, where his family waits. Elena has fallen asleep on the small sofa, her head pillowed on her arm. He lifts her gently and carries her to the bed she shares with Rosa, tucking a thin blanket around her small form. Carlos and Jorge are preparing for sleep, the older boy's hands moving unconsciously, fingers flexing, already practicing the motions he'll need to master. Miguel lies down on his own narrow bed in the corner, feeling every one of his 46 years in his back, his shoulders, his stained and calloused hands. Outside, the city continues its evening rhythms. And somewhere in the factory, in the darkness of the workshop, thousands of cigars rest on their trays, waiting for Monday morning when the work will begin again. His eyes close. In 7 hours, he'll wake in the darkness and begin the walk back to the factory. The same bench, the same tools, the same precise movements repeated hundreds of times. This is his life, measured not in grand achievements or adventures, but in cigars rolled, in days completed, in the quiet satisfaction of craft practiced well. Tomorrow will be Saturday. Then Sunday. Then the week will begin again. His breathing slows, deepens. Sleep comes, as it always does, bringing the rest his body needs to do it all again. Saturday morning arrives like all the others, darkness, silence, the familiar creak of floorboards. But there's something different in the air today, a subtle anticipation. It's payday, and though Miguel would never admit it aloud, the knowledge adds a lightness to his step as he walks the 17 minutes to the factory. Inside, the workshop fills with its usual quiet efficiency. The rollers take their places, Rafael opens his book, and the day begins. But Miguel notices Don Esteban consulting his ledger more frequently than usual, running his finger down columns of numbers, making small marks with his pen. The foreman is calculating the week's production, determining each man's wages down to the last centavo. The factory operates on what's called the tabaquería system, a combination of daily quotas and piece rate payment that requires careful mathematics. Each roller has a base quota they must meet, but anything beyond that quota earns them additional payment at a fixed rate per cigar. The system is designed to encourage productivity while ensuring a minimum standard of output. Miguel has become adept at calculating his own earnings in his head as the week progresses, though the final number sometimes includes adjustments for rejected cigars or damaged materials. This morning, he's working on panatellas, long, thin cigars that require a delicate touch. The challenge with panatellas is maintaining consistent thickness along their entire 7-inch length. Too thick and the draw becomes difficult, too thin and the cigar burns too hot. The wrapper must be cut precisely, with no excess material that might create bulges or weak spots. These cigars are popular with ladies in fashionable Havana society, considered more elegant and refined than the larger, more masculine sizes. Rafael is reading from a technical journal today, an article about advances in tobacco cultivation, about new fermentation techniques being tested in the Remedios region. The rollers listen with professional interest. Though they don't grow the tobacco themselves, they care deeply about its quality. Poor fermentation produces harsh, bitter flavors that no amount of skilled rolling can correct. The relationship between field and factory is intimate, each dependent on the other's expertise. At mid-morning, a group of visitors arrives, 3 well-dressed men accompanied by Don Esteban. They walk slowly through the workshop, pausing to watch the rollers at work. Miguel recognizes this scene. These are potential buyers, wholesale merchants from abroad, perhaps from Spain or the United States. They come to see the cigars being made, to witness the craftsmanship firsthand before placing large orders. The factory owners encourage these visits, understanding that the romance of hand-rolled cigars, the image of skilled artisans plying their ancient trade, is part of what commands premium prices in foreign markets. The visitors watch Miguel's hands for several minutes, murmuring to one another in English. One of them asks Don Esteban a question, and the foreman responds in halting English, gesturing to the tobacco, to Miguel's tools, to the finished cigars on the tray. Miguel continues working, neither slowing nor accelerating his pace. He's been observed like this dozens of times over the years. Some rollers perform for the visitors, adding flourishes to their movements, but Miguel sees no point in it. The work speaks for itself. After a few minutes, the visitors move on to watch old Tomas, whose white hair and gnarled hands make him a more picturesque subject for their curiosity. The morning stretches on. Miguel's fingers move through their familiar patterns, selecting filler, binding, wrapping. He's completed 47 panatellas when the lunch bell rings at noon. In the courtyard, the conversation among the rollers is more animated than usual, everyone discussing their expected wages, making plans for how they'll spend the money. Young Felipe, recovered from yesterday's bout of tobacco sickness, is talking about buying new shoes. His current pair is held together with twine, the soles worn through in places. Carlos, Miguel's son, sits nearby eating his lunch, listening to the older men talk. The boy is learning more than just tobacco work in this factory. He's learning the economics of working-class life, the careful calculations required to survive on limited wages. After lunch, the afternoon settles into its usual rhythm. But at 3 o'clock, something unusual happens. Don Esteban calls for attention, and Rafael stops reading mid-sentence. The foreman announces that the factory has received a special commission, an order from the presidential palace for 500 custom cigars to be presented as diplomatic gifts. The work will be divided among the 5 most senior rollers, with a bonus payment of 50 centavos per 100 cigars. Miguel is one of the 5 selected. The others are Tomas, a man named Raul who's been rolling for 38 years, a quiet roller named Esteban, no relation to the foreman, and a woman named Carmen, one of only 2 female rollers in the entire factory. Carmen's presence is unusual. Most factories employ women only for sorting and banding, but she proved herself exceptional during an apprenticeship and was allowed to continue. She works in a corner of the workshop, slightly separated from the men, and rarely speaks. But her cigars are flawless. The 5 of them are given special tobacco, the finest Vuelta Abajo leaves, aged for 4 years, with wrappers so delicate they seem to glow in the afternoon light. The presidential cigars must be identical in every detail, 6 inches long, 48 ring gauge, medium brown wrappers with no visible veins, perfectly centered caps. They'll be placed in a custom humidor made of Cuban mahogany, lined with Spanish cedar, with a brass plate engraved with the Cuban coat of arms. Miguel feels the weight of this responsibility. These cigars will be held by ambassadors, by visiting dignitaries, perhaps by the president himself. They represent not just the factory but Cuba itself, the island's most famous export, its claim to excellence in a world that often overlooked it. His hands must not fail. He selects his first leaf with exquisite care. The filler must be perfect, balanced flavor from 3 different tobacco types, each contributing its specific character. He's made thousands of cigars in his career, but these feel different. These matter in a way that the daily production does not. The workshop has grown quieter. Even the other rollers, those not selected for the presidential commission, work with extra focus, as if the presence of such important cigars elevates everyone's labor. Rafael has resumed reading, but his voice seems more dignified somehow, matching the gravity of the moment. Miguel completes his first presidential cigar and sets it gently on a velvet-lined tray Don Esteban has provided. It's beautiful, even he can see this objectively. The wrapper is seamless, the color rich and even, the construction firm but not hard. He allows himself a moment of pride before reaching for the next bundle of tobacco. Outside, the afternoon light is golden. In 7 hours, when his shift ends, he'll receive his week's wages. He's already calculated the amount, 10 pesos and 30 centavos for his regular production, plus additional earnings from the presidential cigars. It's more than usual, enough to perhaps buy Jorge new trousers for school, to set aside a little extra for the uncertain times ahead. But that's hours away still. For now, there's only the tobacco, the precise movements, the quiet pride of work done at the highest level of his craft. His hands reach for another leaf, and the afternoon continues, golden and still, filled with the ancient ritual of rolling tobacco into art. By 4 o'clock, Miguel has completed 12 of his assigned presidential cigars. Each one has taken nearly 15 minutes, twice as long as his usual pace, but the precision required allows for no shortcuts. Beside him, old Tomas works even more slowly, his arthritic fingers moving with painful deliberateness. But the results are extraordinary. These cigars are masterpieces, each one a testament to decades of accumulated skill. Don Esteban approaches with a small wooden device Miguel has only seen a few times before, a tira or draw tester. The foreman inserts the pointed end into one of Miguel's completed cigars and draws air through it, testing the resistance. Too loose and the cigar will burn, too hot and fast, too tight and it becomes impossible to smoke. The foreman nods with satisfaction. "Perfect," he says quietly, and Miguel feels a warmth in his chest that has nothing to do with the afternoon heat. The draw tester is used only for the most important cigars, those destined for wealthy clients or special occasions. For the daily production runs, quality control relies mainly on visual inspection and weight measurement. But these presidential cigars demand absolute certainty. Each one must provide the ideal smoking experience, a smooth, even draw that delivers flavor without effort, that burns cleanly and evenly from foot to cap. Rafael has set aside his reading materials and is now discussing something with one of the younger rollers during a brief pause. Miguel overhears fragments of the conversation, something about the upcoming Dia de San Juan festival, about whether the factory will close for the celebration. Different factories have different policies regarding religious holidays. Some close only for Christmas and Easter, others honor the saints' days as well. Miguel's factory typically remains open, though attendance on such days is not strictly enforced. At 4:30, a clerk from the factory office arrives carrying a leather satchel. This is Senor Marquez, the paymaster, a thin man with spectacles who handles all financial matters. He sets up a small table near the entrance and begins calling names, paying out the week's wages in order of seniority. The most senior rollers are paid first, a hierarchy respected even in this small ritual. Miguel continues working on his presidential cigars while the payments proceed. He can hear the quiet exchanges, the rustle of paper money and the clink of coins. Cuban currency in this era is a mixture of pesos and centavos, with workers typically receiving their pay in a combination of bills and heavy copper coins. The coins are substantial, solid in the hand, and Miguel knows that Rosa will sort them carefully when he arrives home, dividing them into the various obligations their family faces. Miguel Hernandez, the paymaster, calls, and Miguel sets down his tools, wipes his hands on his trousers, and approaches the table. Senor Marquez consults his ledger, running his finger down the page. 131 cigars Thursday, 128 Friday, quota exceeded both days. Presidential commission, 12 cigars completed. He counts out the money carefully, 10 pesos in bills, then 30 centavos in coins, then the bonus payment for the special work. Miguel accepts the money and returns to his bench, tucking the bills and coins into the inner pocket of his vest. The weight of them is reassuring. This is the tangible result of his week's labor, 59 hours at the rolling bench, transformed into currency that will sustain his family for the next 7 days. Around him, other rollers receive their wages with varying reactions. Young Felipe counts his money twice, his lips moving silently as he calculates. One of the journeyman rollers, a man named Paco, frowns at his payment and approaches Senor Marquez with a question. There's a brief, quiet discussion about rejected cigars, about deductions for damaged materials. Miguel can't hear the resolution, but Paco returns to his bench looking dissatisfied. The wage system is a constant source of tension in the factories. The rollers are skilled craftsmen, their work requiring years of training and practice, yet they earn only modest wages. Meanwhile, the factory owners live in grand houses in Vedado, drive automobiles, send their children to schools in Europe. The disparity is obvious to everyone, spoken of in whispers but rarely challenged directly. The owners control the tobacco, the facilities, the access to markets, they hold all the power. But there are whispers of change. Raphael has read articles about labor reforms being debated in the Cuban legislature, about proposals to establish minimum wages and maximum working hours. Some of the younger rollers speak hopefully about these possibilities. Miguel is less optimistic. He's seen reforms promised before, seen them disappear into the political machinery of Havana, emerging as weak compromises that change little. He returns his attention to the tobacco before him. Politics and economics exist in a realm beyond his control, but this, the selection of the perfect leaf, the precise cutting of the wrapper, the careful rolling, this is his domain. Here, his skill matters. Here, he has mastery. The presidential cigar taking shape in his hands is perhaps the finest he's ever made. The wrapper is seamless, the construction flawless. When some dignitary lights this cigar at a state dinner or a diplomatic reception, they'll never know Miguel's name, never know the calloused hands that created it. But he'll know. That knowledge is enough. At 5 o'clock, the aguador makes his afternoon rounds. Miguel drinks his water and notices that the workshop has taken on a different atmosphere since the wage payments began. There's a subtle relaxation, a sense of the week's burden being lifted. Even the light seems different, softer, more golden, as the day moves toward its conclusion. Carmen, the female roller working on the presidential commission, completes her 20th cigar. Miguel has been keeping a mental count of everyone's progress. At this rate, the 500 cigars will be finished by Wednesday of next week. Don Esteban has already mentioned that the completed cigars will spend 10 days in the aging room before being boxed and delivered to the presidential palace. Even these special cigars require rest after rolling, allowing the different tobacco leaves to blend and harmonize. Miguel thinks about the journey these cigars will take. From the fields of Pinar del Rio to the curing barns, from the fermentation piles to the warehouse aging rooms, from his hands to the presidential humidor, and finally to the lips of powerful men who make decisions affecting millions of lives. It's a strange thing to contemplate, that his humble labor connects him, however distantly, to the centers of power. But such thoughts are abstractions. What's real is the tobacco in his hands, the ache in his back, the weight of coins in his pocket. What's real is the knowledge that Rosa is waiting at home, that his children will eat tonight, that tomorrow he can rest and maintain his tools and perhaps sleep a few extra hours in the morning. The afternoon wears on. Raphael resumes reading, a short story by a Cuban author, something about fishermen and the sea. The words wash over Miguel like waves, familiar and soothing. His hands continue their work, building beauty from dried leaves, creating small monuments to human patience and skill. Outside, the city prepares for Saturday evening. Street vendors begin packing up their wares. Families prepare their weekend meals. Church bells mark the hours. And inside the factory, in the golden light of late afternoon, Miguel and his fellow rollers practice their ancient craft, their hands moving in patterns learned over lifetimes, creating cigars that will travel the world and carry with them a small piece of Cuba's soul. At 6 o'clock, with 1 hour remaining in the workday, Miguel pauses to stretch his neck and shoulders. He's completed 18 presidential cigars now, each one meeting Don Esteban's exacting standards. The pile of perfect cylinders on the velvet tray represents not just his skill, but the culmination of knowledge passed down through generations, techniques refined over centuries, small adjustments and improvements added by countless anonymous hands. The tradition of Cuban cigar rolling stretches back more than 100 years, to the early 1800s when the first factories were established in Havana. Before that, cigars were rolled individually by small farmers or in primitive workshops, with little consistency or quality control. But the factory system changed everything, bringing together skilled workers under one roof, standardizing techniques, creating the conditions for true mastery to develop. Miguel's own lineage in this trade goes back 3 generations. His grandfather learned the craft in the 1860s, during the 10 Years' War, when the island was torn by conflict between Spanish colonial forces and Cuban independence fighters. Even during those violent years, the tobacco factories continued operating, producing cigars for both sides of the conflict. His grandfather told stories of rolling tobacco while artillery fire echoed in the distance, of Spanish soldiers and Cuban rebels who both treasured their cigars despite being enemies. That grandfather passed his knowledge to Miguel's father, who in turn taught Miguel the fundamentals before he entered his formal apprenticeship. These family traditions are common in the tobacco trade, knowledge flowing from father to son, uncle to nephew, creating dynasties of skill within the factory walls. Miguel wonders if his own grandson, not yet born, will someday sit at a rolling bench and shape tobacco with hands that carry the same inherited talent. Raphael has finished the short story and moved on to reading from a gazette about international affairs. He reads about political developments in Europe, about economic conditions in the United States, about ships arriving in Havana harbor carrying goods from distant ports. The rollers listen with varying degrees of interest. These foreign matters seem very far away from the realities of their daily lives, yet they're connected. The cigars they roll are purchased by those distant countries, their livelihoods dependent on the tastes and whims of foreign consumers. At 6:30, one of the factory's maintenance workers enters pushing a cart loaded with fresh cedar planks. These will be used to repair the storage boxes in the aging room, where thousands of cigars rest at any given time. Cedar is essential to cigar storage. The wood's natural oils help regulate humidity and impart a subtle, pleasant aroma to the tobacco. Every cigar box, every aging shelf, every humidor is lined with Spanish cedar, imported at great expense from Central America. The scent of fresh cedar mingles with the ever-present tobacco aroma, creating a combination that Miguel finds deeply comforting. This smell is the perfume of his profession, the olfactory signature of his entire adult life. Even when he's away from the factory, even on Sundays, the scent lingers in his clothing, his hair, embedded so deeply that Rosa jokes she could find him in complete darkness simply by following her nose. Don Esteban makes another inspection round, this time accompanied by a man Miguel doesn't recognize, another well-dressed visitor, this one carrying a leather notebook and making frequent notes with a silver pen. The stranger watches the rollers with an analytical eye, occasionally asking the foreman questions in Spanish accented with what sounds like Italian. Miguel overhears fragments, questions about production rates, about quality control measures, about the cost of raw materials. Foreign investors and competitors are always circling the Cuban tobacco industry, Miguel knows. They come to study the methods, to understand what makes Cuban cigars superior to those produced elsewhere. Some countries, Honduras, Nicaragua, even the United States, have tried to replicate Cuban quality, but something in the combination of Cuba's soil, climate, and accumulated expertise remains impossible to duplicate. The finest tobacco still grows in Cuban fields, and the finest rollers still work in Cuban factories. The visitor pauses at Miguel's bench, observing the presidential cigars with evident admiration. He asks Don Esteban something, and the foreman responds with obvious pride, gesturing to Miguel, to Tomas, to the other selected rollers. The visitor makes more notes, then moves on. Miguel returns to his work, unbothered by the scrutiny. Let them watch, let them study, some knowledge cannot be stolen, only earned through years of dedicated practice. At 6:45, Miguel begins his final presidential cigar of the day. His hands are tired now, the muscles in his forearms tight and sore, but he forces himself to maintain absolute concentration. This cigar must be as perfect as the first one he rolled this afternoon. There can be no degradation in quality, no excuse of fatigue. The standard is the standard, regardless of circumstance. He selects the filler with meticulous care, 3 types of tobacco from different parts of the plant, from different fields, each contributing its essential character. The Valladolid leaves for combustion, ensuring the cigar burns evenly. The Seco leaves for aroma, providing the subtle fragrances that make Cuban tobacco distinctive. The Ligero leaves for strength and flavor, the boldest and most robust tobacco from the plant's uppermost sections. These 3 components must be balanced precisely, their proportions calculated to create the ideal smoking experience. The science of tobacco blending is complex, passed down from the factory's master blenders who spend their entire careers studying the subtle variations between leaves, between harvests, between growing regions. They create the recipes that rollers like Miguel execute, specifying exactly which tobaccos to combine and in what proportions. A master blender might sample tobacco from 20 different fields before deciding on the final composition for a particular cigar line. Miguel wraps the filler in its binder leaf, then reaches for the wrapper, a flawless piece of corojo leaf, grown specifically for its thin texture and attractive appearance. The corojo plant is a relatively recent development in Cuban tobacco cultivation, created by crossing different tobacco varieties to produce leaves ideal for wrappers. It's more delicate than other tobacco types, requiring careful handling and perfect growing conditions, but the results are worth the extra effort. His hands perform their final dance of the day, spiraling the wrapper around the cigar's length at the precise 45-degree angle, creating the signature pattern that marks a well-made Cuban cigar. The cap is formed, sealed with a tiny drop of gum arabic, smoothed into invisible perfection. It's done. He sets the 19th presidential cigar on the velvet tray and allows himself a moment of satisfaction. 19 perfect cigars in a single afternoon. Not his highest production, he's made more on regular days, but certainly his finest work. Each one is a small masterpiece, worthy of its destination. The 7 o'clock bell rings, its deep tone reverberating through the workshop. Around Miguel, the other rollers begin their end-of-day rituals, cleaning tools, covering tobacco, stretching tired muscles. The week is finished. 2 days of rest await, then the cycle will begin again. Miguel cleans his chaveta with particular care tonight, mindful that Monday will bring more presidential cigars, more work that demands absolute precision. The blade gleams in the fading light as he wipes away the last traces of tobacco oil. He wraps it in its cloth and places it in the small wooden box where he keeps his personal tools. Don Esteban approaches as Miguel prepares to leave. "Excellent work today, Miguel," the foreman says, a rare compliment. "The Presidential Commission is fortunate to have your hands creating their cigars." Miguel nods, accepting the praise with quiet dignity. Then the foreman adds, "Your son Carlos, he's been asking about moving to the rolling benches. I've been watching him. He has steady hands. If you think he's ready, we could begin his observation period next month." Miguel feels the weight of this moment. His son, following him into the trade. The continuation of the family tradition. Part of him wants something different for Carlos, something easier, with less strain on the body and more security in old age. But another part, the part that understands the deep satisfaction of mastering a craft, of creating beauty with one's hands, recognizes that this might be the best path available to the boy. "Thank you, Don Esteban," Miguel says. "I'll speak with him tonight." He walks out into the evening air, joining the stream of workers flowing from the factory gates. The money in his pocket feels heavier than usual, the regular wages plus the presidential bonus. In his mind, he's already planning new shoes for Jorge, fabric for Rosa to make Elena a dress, perhaps even a small amount set aside in case of emergency. The streets are alive with Saturday evening energy, music drifting from open doorways, the smell of frying food, children playing their last games before being called inside for dinner. Miguel walks through it all, a tired man with tobacco-stained hands and a week's wages in his pocket, heading home to his family. Above him, the first evening stars are appearing in the deepening sky. Somewhere in the presidential palace, humidors wait empty, soon to be filled with the fruits of his labor. Somewhere across the ocean, in cities he'll never visit, people smoke cigars he's made, never knowing his name, never thinking about the hands that shaped them. But that's all right. Miguel's satisfaction doesn't come from recognition or fame. It comes from the work itself, from the knowledge that he's done it well, that his skill matters, that his hands have created something of value. He turns onto his street and sees his home ahead, the warm light in the window, his family waiting inside. The week is done. He's earned his wages honestly. Tomorrow he can rest. Tonight, he's just grateful to be home. Miguel pushes open the door to his home, and immediately the familiar warmth envelopes him. Rosa is at the stove, stirring something in a pot that fills the small space with the aroma of garlic and cumin. Elena runs to him as she always does, and he lifts her with arms that protest the movement after a long day's work. "Show me your hands, Papa," she says, a ritual they've developed. He holds out his palms, and she traces the brown stains with her small finger. "Still there," she announces solemnly, as if expecting them to have disappeared. "Always there," he tells her, setting her down gently. Carlos is sitting at the table, and Miguel notices a book open before him, not a school book, but something else. He moves closer and sees it's a manual on tobacco cultivation, borrowed from somewhere. The boy looks up, slightly embarrassed to be caught studying. "Don Esteban spoke to me today," Miguel says, and Carlos's eyes widen. "He says you can begin observation next month. Morning and afternoon breaks, you'll watch the rollers work. Learn the techniques." The boy's face transforms with excitement, but Miguel raises a hand. "It's not easy, what we do. Your hands will hurt for months, maybe years. The pay isn't generous. And there are risks. You saw Felipe yesterday, the tobacco sickness. Some men develop breathing problems after decades in the factories, their lungs weakened by the constant dust in the air. This last is something Miguel has been noticing more in recent years, older rollers developing persistent coughs, struggling for breath after climbing stairs. The factory owners claim the tobacco dust is harmless, but the workers know better. They've seen too many retired rollers spending their final years wheezing and weak, their bodies betrayed by the very substance that gave them their livelihood. "I understand, Papa," Carlos says quietly. "But I want to learn. I want to be a torcedor like you." Miguel nods slowly. What else can he say? The boy has chosen, and perhaps it's the best choice available. At least in the factory, there's a path forward, apprentice to journeyman to master. At least there's the possibility of pride in one's work. Rosa serves dinner, ropa vieja tonight, the shredded beef stretched with vegetables to feed 5 mouths. It's Saturday, so there's a little more meat than usual, a small celebration of the week's completion. They eat together, the children chattering about their day while Miguel and Rosa exchange quiet glances across the table, the wordless communication of a couple who've been together for 17 years. After dinner, Miguel retrieves the week's wages from his pocket and counts them out on the table. Rosa watches, her practiced eye calculating as the bills and coins accumulate. 10 pesos, 30 centavos, plus the bonus for the presidential cigars. She divides the money into small piles: rent, food, clothing, a few centavos for the church collection, a tiny amount set aside for emergencies. the economics of working-class life in 1920s Cuba leave little room for luxury. Rent for their small home consumes nearly a quarter of Miguel's wages. Food takes another third, sometimes more when prices rise at the market. Clothing must be carefully maintained, patched and repaired until it's literally falling apart. There's no money for entertainment, for books beyond what Jorge borrows from school, for anything beyond the most basic necessities. Miguel knows that in other parts of Havana, in the grand homes of Miramar and Vedado, families spend more on a single dinner party than his family earns in a month. The contrast is stark, undeniable. But he pushes such thoughts away. Bitterness serves no purpose. This is the life he has, and he's determined to live it with dignity. The presidential bonus helps, Rosa says softly, gathering the coins into a small cloth bag. We can get Jorge those trousers, and maybe some medicine for your back. Miguel's back has been bothering him more lately, a persistent ache that settles deep in his spine after long days at the rolling bench. He knows what causes it, the unnatural posture, the constant hunching forward, year after year of sitting on a backless stool. Many older rollers develop chronic back problems, their spines gradually curving from decades of the same position. Some eventually become so bent they can barely stand upright. It's not so bad, he says, though they both know this is a lie. Later, after the children are asleep, Miguel sits outside with his evening cigar. The night is warm and still, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine from a neighbor's garden. He can hear music drifting from somewhere down the street, a guitar, a woman's voice singing a bolero about lost love. Tomorrow is Sunday. He'll wake late, perhaps 7 or even 8 o'clock, a luxury he allows himself only once a week. He'll sharpen his tools in the backyard while Rosa takes the children to early mass. In the afternoon, there might be a gathering in the plaza, other factory workers and their families socializing, sharing food, the men discussing work while the women talk of household matters and the children play. Sunday afternoons sometimes bring visits from the union organizers, men with passionate voices and printed pamphlets tucked under their arms. They speak of workers' solidarity, of the power of collective action, of the changes that could come if only the rollers would stand together and demand their rights. Miguel listens to these speeches with mixed feelings. Part of him is stirred by their vision of a more just world. But another part remembers the failed strikes, the families that went hungry, the men who lost everything. The cigar in his hand burns down slowly, the ember glowing in the darkness. This tobacco is harsh compared to what he works with in the factory, lower quality leaves, imperfectly fermented, rolled without the precision he brings to his professional work. But it's his, purchased with his own earnings, smoked in his own time. There's a freedom in that which makes even rough tobacco taste sweet. He thinks about the presidential cigars waiting in the factory, about the journey they'll take from his hands to the humidors of power. He thinks about Carlos, soon to begin his own journey into this trade. He thinks about the thousands of cigars he's rolled over 23 years, each one a small piece of his life transformed into smoke and ash, dispersed into air and forgotten. Is this a good life? He's not sure how to answer that question. It's a hard life, certainly. His body aches constantly. His lungs aren't what they used to be. His hands are permanently stained and calloused. He'll never be wealthy, never see the world beyond Cuba's shores, never escape the endless cycle of quotas and wages and bills to pay. But there's honor in it too. Honor in mastering a difficult craft. Honor in providing for his family through honest labor. Honor in creating something beautiful, even if that beauty is temporary, consumed and lost. His grandfather rolled cigars. His father rolled cigars. Now he rolls cigars, and soon Carlos will join him. The tradition continues, passed down through generations like a sacred trust. Above him, the stars will slowly across the sky, indifferent to human concerns. Somewhere in the city, in factories and workshops, other men labor through the night shift: bakers, printers, dockworkers. The world continues its endless rotation, and each person plays their small part in the vast machinery of existence. Miguel finishes his cigar and grinds the stub beneath his heel. The night is growing late, and tomorrow, even though it's Sunday, will come early. Rosa is already asleep inside, her breathing soft and regular. He stands, feeling the familiar protest in his back and knees, and makes his way to bed. The week is done. A new week will begin soon enough. And in between, there's Sunday, a day of rest, a day to remember that he's more than just a pair of hands that roll tobacco. He's a father, a husband, a man with thoughts and dreams of his own. He lies down in the darkness and closes his eyes. Sleep comes quickly, bringing dreams of tobacco fields under endless sun, of his hands moving through familiar patterns, creating perfect spirals that rise like smoke into an impossibly blue sky. Sunday morning arrives gently, without the harsh urgency of the workweek. Miguel wakes to sunlight streaming through the window, the sounds of the neighborhood already alive with activity, church bells ringing, vendors calling out their wares, children laughing in the street. He stretches slowly, feeling each vertebra protest the movement, and notes with satisfaction that the clock on the wall reads 7:30. Rosa and the children have already left for early mass at the Church of San Francisco de Paula, 3 streets away. Miguel is not a devout man, his faith is quiet and private, expressed more in the way he lives than in regular attendance at services. But Rosa finds comfort in the rituals, and he would never deny her that. Besides, Sunday morning Mass serves a social function as well as a spiritual one. The women of the neighborhood gather there, sharing news and gossip, forming the networks of mutual support that help working families survive difficult times. He rises and makes coffee, the ritual movements comforting in their familiarity. The coffee is strong and bitter, sweetened with a precious spoonful of sugar. He takes it outside to the small yard, where his tools wait on a wooden bench. The chaveta, the measuring guides, the small knife he uses for trimming, each one needs attention, needs care. He begins with the chaveta, running his thumb carefully along the blade's edge. It's still sharp, but he can feel the microscopic irregularities that develop after a week of constant use. He fetches his whetstone from inside, a fine-grained stone imported from Spain, a gift from his father many years ago when Miguel first became a master roller. The stone itself has a history. His father received it from his own master when he completed his apprenticeship in 1895. Miguel wets the stone with a few drops of water and begins the meditative process of sharpening. The blade moves across the stone in long, smooth strokes, the steel singing softly against the abrasive surface. This is a skill in itself, knowing the angle, knowing the pressure, knowing when the edge has achieved the perfect sharpness. Too dull and the tobacco tears, too sharp and the blade is fragile, prone to chipping. The rhythmic scraping of metal on stone is almost musical. Miguel has been sharpening tools for so long that his hands know the motion without conscious thought. His mind wanders to other things, to Carlos beginning his observation period next month, to the presidential cigars waiting in the factory's aging room, to the persistent ache in his lower back that even Sunday's rest doesn't fully relieve. After 30 minutes, the chaveta is perfect. He tests it carefully on a scrap of tobacco leaf he's kept for this purpose, and the blade slices through cleanly, leaving an edge so straight it might have been cut with a ruler. Satisfied, he sets it aside and begins work on his other tools, checking them for wear, cleaning away the accumulated residue of tobacco oils. By the time Rosa and the children return from Mass, it's nearly 10 o'clock. Elena runs to show him a small prayer card she received from the priest, depicting Saint Joseph with his carpenter's tools. "He made things with his hands too, Papa," she says earnestly. "Like you." Miguel smiles. Yes, mi cielo. Like me, but with wood instead of tobacco. The comparison pleases her, and she runs off to show Jorge her treasure. Rosa begins preparing lunch. Sunday meals are slightly more elaborate than weekday fare. Today there will be arroz con pollo, chicken and rice cooked with saffron that turns it golden yellow. The saffron is expensive, a small luxury saved for Sundays and special occasions. It's imported from Spain, arriving in Havana's port along with wine, olive oil, and other goods that connect Cuba to its colonial past. While Rosa cooks, Miguel sits at the table with his sons. Carlos has returned to his tobacco cultivation manual, and Jorge is working on arithmetic problems from school. Miguel watches them, these boys who carry his blood, who will make their own paths through the world. Carlos will roll tobacco, that seems certain now. But perhaps Jorge might find something different, something that doesn't extract such a toll on the body. How is school, Jorge? Miguel asks. The boy looks up, his expression complicated. It's fine, Papa. But... He hesitates. But what? Some of the other boys, their fathers have different jobs. One boy's father works at the National Bank. Another's father is a clerk at the customs house. They wear clean clothes to work. Their hands aren't stained. Miguel feels the words like a physical blow, though he keeps his face neutral. Those are good jobs, he says carefully. Important work. But what we do in the factory is important too. Cuban cigars are known throughout the world. Kings and presidents smoke what we make. That matters. Jorge nods, but Miguel can see the doubt in his eyes. The boy is 12, old enough to notice the differences in status, in wealth, in the respect society grants to different kinds of labor. A bank clerk earns more than a cigar roller and works in a clean office with regular hours. A customs official has a government position with a pension. These things matter, especially to a boy beginning to imagine his future. The education system in Cuba offers some opportunities for advancement, but they're limited. Public schools provide basic literacy and arithmetic, but higher education requires money most working families don't have. There's the University of Havana, prestigious and old, but its students are almost exclusively from wealthy families. The children of tobacco workers rarely walk those halls. Still, Miguel knows that literacy itself is valuable. Many of the older rollers in his factory can barely read, they rely entirely on Rafael's readings to access news and literature. But the younger generation, including Miguel's own sons, attend school for at least a few years. They can read newspapers, write letters, do calculations. This knowledge opens doors, even if those doors lead to rooms not so different from the ones their fathers occupy. Keep studying, Miguel tells Jorge. Learn everything you can. Maybe you'll find a different path than your brother and me. Rosa calls them to lunch, and they gather around the small table. The arroz con pollo is fragrant and golden, the chicken tender, seasoned with oregano and garlic. There's also tostines, fried plantains, crispy and salty, and a small salad of tomatoes and onions dressed with vinegar. By the standards of working-class Havana, this is a feast. They eat slowly, savoring the food and the rare luxury of eating together without the pressure of Monday morning looming just hours away. Elena chatters about the other children at church, about a girl who wore a new dress, about the priest's cat that sits on the church steps and accepts offerings of affection from the congregation. Her innocence, her ability to find joy in simple things, touches something deep in Miguel's heart. After lunch, Miguel prepares for the afternoon gathering in the plaza. Many of the neighborhood's working men congregate there on Sunday afternoons, cigar rollers, yes, but also construction workers, dock laborers, shop clerks, anyone who works 6 days a week and treasures their single day of rest. The women sometimes come too, bringing children who play while the adults talk. Miguel puts on a clean shirt, not his work clothes, which are permanently marked by tobacco, but a simple white cotton shirt Rosa has washed and pressed. He tucks a few home-rolled cigars into his pocket. At these gatherings, men share their tobacco, passing cigars around as a gesture of camaraderie and mutual respect. The plaza is only a 5-minute walk from his home, a small square with a few benches under the shade of laurel trees. When Miguel arrives, perhaps 20 men are already there, clustered in small groups, talking and smoking. He recognizes most of them: Tomas from the factory, several other rollers, men from neighboring houses whose names he knows but whose lives remain largely mysterious to him. He joins a group that includes Tomas and 2 younger rollers, Felipe and a man named Gustavo. They're discussing the upcoming harvest season in Pinar del Rio. The tobacco harvest typically begins in November and extends through February, with the finest leaves picked in January when the plants have reached perfect maturity. Though none of these men work in the fields themselves, they follow the harvest closely. Their livelihoods depend on the quality and quantity of tobacco that arrives at the factory warehouses. "I heard this year's crop is exceptional," Gustavo says. "The rains came at exactly the right time, and the soil conditions were perfect." Don Esteban says we might see some of the finest tobacco in a decade. Miguel listens thoughtfully. Good harvests mean more work, better tobacco to roll, potentially higher wages if production increases. Poor harvests mean the opposite: reduced hours, inferior materials, financial uncertainty. The roller's fate is tied intimately to factors completely beyond their control: weather patterns, soil conditions, the agricultural expertise of farmers they'll never meet. The conversation shifts to labor matters. One of the men has heard rumors of strikes being planned at several factories in central Havana, demands for a reduction in the workday from 10 hours to 8. The idea generates mixed reactions. Some of the younger men are enthusiastic, energized by the possibility of change. The older ones, like Tomas and Miguel, are more cautious. 8 hours sounds good until you realize the owners will simply pay us less, Tomas says, his voice rough with age and cynicism. "We're paid by the piece, not by the hour. Fewer hours means fewer cigars means less money. How does that help our families?" "But maybe they'd increase the piece rate," Felipe argues. "Maybe we could negotiate for both, shorter hours and better pay per cigar. And maybe the stars will fall from the sky and we'll all be rich," Tomas responds, but there's no real malice in his tone. He's simply stating what he sees as obvious reality. Miguel remains quiet during this exchange, smoking his cigar and watching the other men's faces. He understands both perspectives, the desire for change and the fear of what change might cost. These tensions run through the entire working class of Havana, dividing generations, creating fractures even as union organizers preach solidarity. The afternoon sun climbs higher, and the conversation in the plaza drifts from politics to more personal matters. One of the men mentions that his daughter is getting married next month, a cause for celebration, though also for financial anxiety. Weddings, even modest ones, require resources that working families struggle to provide. There will be a small ceremony at the church, a reception in the family's home with food and music, perhaps a new dress for the bride if her mother can manage the sewing. In Cuban working-class culture, these family celebrations carry enormous importance. They're moments that break the monotony of labor, that affirm connections beyond the factory walls. Miguel attended many such weddings in his youth, and his own wedding to Rosa 17 years ago was celebrated in much the same way, a simple ceremony followed by an evening of dancing and rum, the neighborhood coming together to witness and bless the union. The conversation turns to food, as it often does among men who work hard and eat simply. Someone mentions the price of rice has increased again at the market. Another complains about the quality of the beef available in their neighborhood. The best cuts go to the wealthy areas, leaving only tough, stringy meat for working families. These economic grievances are constant background noise in their lives, small frustrations that accumulate but rarely lead to direct action. Miguel notices a man standing at the edge of the plaza, watching the gathering with interest. He's younger than most of the workers here, perhaps 30, dressed more formally in a pressed suit despite the heat. After a few minutes, the man approaches their group and introduces himself as Alberto Morales, an organizer with the Confederación Nacional Obrera de Cuba, the National Workers' Confederation of Cuba, one of the island's growing labor unions. The union movement in Cuba has been gaining strength throughout the 1920s, organizing workers across different industries, pressing for reforms and better conditions. The CNOC is among the most active, with particular strength in Havana's tobacco factories. But the movement faces constant opposition from factory owners and, sometimes, from government authorities who view labor organizing as a threat to social order. Morales speaks with passion and conviction. He talks about the successful strike at the Partagas factory 2 months ago, where workers won a 5% increase in piece rates after walking out for a week. He speaks of solidarity, of the power workers hold when they act collectively, of the future that could be built if only the torcedors would stand together. Miguel listens carefully, weighing the man's words against his own experience. The Partagas strike is well known among rollers. It's true that the workers won their wage increase, but it's also true that 3 men lost their jobs in the aftermath, quietly dismissed for being troublemakers. The factory owners have long memories and subtle ways of punishing those who challenge their authority. What about the men who get blacklisted? Tomas asks, voicing the concern many share. I knew a roller at the La Corona factory, participated in a strike 5 years ago. He hasn't worked in a tobacco factory since. Too old to learn a new trade, family to support. You say stand together, but what happens to the ones who fall? Morales acknowledges the risk. That's exactly why we need solidarity, he says. When every worker stands together, they can't fire all of us. The factories need our skills, our hands. We have more power than we realize. The blacklist system is an open secret in Havana's tobacco industry. Factory owners share information about difficult workers, those who organize, who speak out, who challenge authority. Once blacklisted, a roller can find himself unable to secure employment at any major factory. Some blacklisted workers end up rolling cigars in small, illegal workshops that operate outside the regulated system, producing inferior products for pennies. Others leave the trade entirely, their years of acquired skill rendered worthless by their political activity. The conversation continues for another hour, Morales making his case while the workers ask hard questions born of practical concerns. Miguel respects the organizers' dedication, but he remains unconvinced that collective action will lead to anything but hardship for those who participate. The power imbalance seems too great, the risks too high. Eventually, Morales distributes pamphlets, printed sheets announcing a workers' meeting next Sunday at a hall near the harbor. Come hear what your fellow workers are planning, he urges. Even if you just listen. Knowledge is power. Then he moves on to another group of men, continuing his rounds through the plaza. Miguel accepts a pamphlet and tucks it into his pocket without reading it. He'll look at it later, perhaps, though he doubts he'll attend the meeting. He has too much to lose, his position as a master roller, his steady wages, the fragile security his family depends upon. The afternoon wears on, and gradually the gathering begins to disperse. Men drift away in ones and twos, heading home to their families, to evening meals, to the last precious hours of Sunday before Monday arrives with its demands. Miguel walks home with Tomas, the old man moving slowly, his body bent from decades at the rolling bench. "What do you think of the organizer?" Miguel asks. Tomas is silent for a moment, considering. "I think he means well," he says finally. "I think he believes what he's saying. But I've lived through too many failed strikes, seen too many men broken by standing up to the owners. Maybe the young ones can afford to take risks. But at my age..." He trails off, the sentence unfinished but the meaning clear. They part ways at the corner, and Miguel continues home alone. The evening is approaching, the sky taking on the golden quality that precedes sunset. Children play in the streets, their voices high and bright. Somewhere nearby, someone is cooking picadillo, and the smell of seasoned ground beef mingles with the ever-present tobacco scent that clings to Miguel's skin. At home, he finds Rosa preparing a light supper, leftover rice from lunch, fried with eggs and bits of ham, simple but filling. The children are quiet, Jorge reading by the window, Carlos sketching something in a notebook, Elena playing with a doll made from corn husks and scraps of fabric. Miguel settles into his chair and watches his family, feeling the weight of responsibility that never quite lifts from his shoulders. Every decision he makes, whether to join a strike, whether to let Carlos enter the trade, how to stretch wages across a week's necessities, carries consequences for these people he loves more than his own life. Rosa catches his eye and smiles, a small, knowing expression. She understands these burdens. She carries her own version of them: how to feed 5 people on limited money, how to keep clothes mended and children healthy, how to maintain hope when circumstances press down like a physical weight. After supper, as darkness settles over the city, Miguel steps outside one final time. Tomorrow the cycle begins again, the early wake, the walk to the factory, the endless hours at the rolling bench. But tonight, he allows himself to simply exist in this moment, neither looking back at the week that's past nor forward to the week that's coming. He thinks about the tobacco growing in distant fields, about the leaves drying in curing barns, about the precise moment when they'll arrive at the factory and pass through his hands, transformed by his skill into cigars that will travel the world. He thinks about the presidential cigars waiting in the aging room, about the invisible thread connecting his labor to the centers of power. Most of all, he thinks about his hands, these stained, calloused, aching hands that are both his fortune and his burden. They've rolled hundreds of thousands of cigars over 23 years. They'll roll hundreds of thousands more before age or illness finally stops them. They're the only real capital he possesses, the only thing that stands between his family and destitution. Above him, stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The city grows quieter as families retreat into their homes, as the day's labor gives way to night's rest. Somewhere in the distance, a radio plays, Cuban sun music, guitars and trumpets and a singer's voice carrying across the warm air. Miguel allows himself one more small cigar, the last of his Sunday indulgence. He smokes it slowly, tasting the harsh tobacco, feeling the smoke fill his lungs. In a few hours, he'll sleep. In a few more hours, he'll wake. And then it all begins again, the walk, the work, the endless transformation of tobacco into art and commerce. This is his life. Not the life he dreamed of as a boy, perhaps, but the life he has. And in its own way, it has dignity. It has purpose. It has moments of quiet satisfaction that money cannot measure. He finishes his cigar as the last light fades from the western sky. Tomorrow is Monday. The workshop waits. The tobacco waits. His hands, rested and ready, will do what they've always done: create beauty from dried leaves, craft perfection from imperfect materials, transform labor into something approaching art. Tomorrow. But tonight, there's only this: the soft darkness, the distant music, the warmth of home just beyond the door. Tonight, he can rest. Monday morning arrives in darkness, as it always does. Miguel wakes at 4:30, his body responding to rhythms so deeply ingrained they require no conscious thought. He moves through his morning ritual, the coffee, the simple breakfast, the gathering of his leather satchel. Rosa stirs but doesn't fully wake, and he's grateful for the silence. Some mornings require no words. The walk to the factory feels different today, though Miguel can't quite identify why. Perhaps it's the knowledge that Carlos will soon walk this same path, joining the long lineage of men in their family who've given their lives to tobacco. Perhaps it's the pamphlet still tucked in his pocket, the organizer's words echoing in his mind. Or perhaps it's simply Monday, the beginning of another week, another cycle, the wheel turning as it always has. Inside the factory, the familiar scene unfolds. The rollers take their positions, the tobacco is distributed, Don Esteban makes his rounds. But this morning, the foreman pauses at Miguel's bench with news. The presidential cigars, he announces, will be presented to the palace on Friday. A photograph will be taken of the presentation ceremony, the factory owner shaking hands with a government official, the ornate humidor displayed prominently. The photograph will appear in the newspapers and in the factory's promotional materials used to attract foreign buyers. Miguel nods, unsurprised. This is how it always works. The factory owner receives credit, his name attached to the work, while the actual makers remain anonymous. In the cigar industry, the brand is everything: Romeo y Julieta, H. Upmann, Montecristo, Hoyo de Monterrey. These names are known worldwide, appearing on box labels alongside elaborate imagery and gold lettering. But the individual rollers, the men and women whose hands actually create the cigars, have no such recognition. The brand names themselves carry fascinating histories. Some are named after famous literature: Romeo y Julieta after Shakespeare's tragedy, Montecristo after the Dumas novel. Others bear the names of their founders or owners. The brand system emerged in the mid-1800s as cigar production industrialized and factories competed for market share. A strong brand meant premium prices, customer loyalty, protection against competitors. The rollers understood this, even as they recognized their own expendability within it. At mid-morning, Rafael begins reading from a novel by José Martí, Cuba's national hero and independence martyr. Martí died in 1895, fighting for Cuban freedom from Spanish rule, but his words still resonate 30 years later. He wrote about dignity in labor, about the nobility of those who work with their hands, about building a just society where all people have value regardless of their station. Miguel listens to these passages with particular attention. Martí had worked briefly in a cigar factory himself during his exile in Florida, rolling tobacco alongside other Cuban expatriates who dreamed of their homeland's liberation. He understood the life, the struggles, the small indignities. His words carry weight because they emerge from genuine experience, not abstract theory. The morning passes in its accustomed rhythm. Miguel works on the presidential commission, each cigar receiving the same meticulous attention as the first one he rolled Saturday afternoon. By noon, he's completed his 28th and 29th cigars for the order. The 5 selected rollers are making good progress. At this rate, all 500 will be finished by Wednesday, leaving 2 days for final inspection and boxing before Friday's presentation. During lunch, Miguel sits with Tomás under their usual ceiba tree. The old man is eating slowly, his movements stiff and painful. Miguel knows what this means: Tomás won't last much longer at the rolling bench. Perhaps another year, perhaps only months. And then what? The factory provides no pension, no support for workers whose bodies give out after decades of service. Tomás will depend on his children, if they can afford to help, or face destitution. I've been thinking about what the organizer said, Tomás says quietly. About pensions. About the factory owners setting aside money for workers when they can no longer roll. He pauses, chewing slowly. It'll never happen in my lifetime. But maybe for you younger ones. Maybe for your son. Miguel considers this. A pension system would transform everything, would mean that decades of skilled labor earn something beyond weekly wages, would provide dignity in old age instead of dependence and poverty. But such systems exist mainly for government workers and professionals, not for factory laborers. The idea that tobacco workers might deserve the same seems almost fantastical. The cigarette factories in America have started implementing some worker benefits, Tomas continues. I heard Rafael read about it last month. Health insurance, retirement funds. The companies there realize that keeping experienced workers is worth the investment. This is partially true, Miguel knows. The American tobacco industry, increasingly mechanized and corporate, has begun experimenting with worker welfare programs, though primarily to prevent unionization rather than from genuine concern for employee well-being. Cigarette production has become highly automated, with machines rolling thousands of cigarettes per hour, requiring fewer skilled workers than cigar production. But cigars, especially premium cigars, resist mechanization. The human hand remains essential, which theoretically gives workers leverage, though that leverage has rarely translated into meaningful improvements. The afternoon brings an unexpected visitor. Don Esteban escorts a journalist through the workshop, a young man with a notebook and camera, here to write a story about Cuban cigar craftsmanship for an American magazine. The journalist asks to photograph Miguel at work, attracted by his focused expression and the presidential cigars on his tray. Miguel continues rolling while the camera captures his image, the tobacco-stained hands, the precise movements, the concentration. The journalist asks questions through Don Esteban, who translates, "How long has Miguel been rolling? What makes Cuban cigars superior? Does he take pride in his work?" Miguel answers briefly, honestly. Yes, he takes pride. Yes, Cuban tobacco and Cuban skill combine to create something exceptional. No, he cannot imagine doing anything else. The photograph will appear in the magazine alongside others, images of tobacco fields, drying barns, the factory's elegant facade. The article will romanticize the craft, presenting it as picturesque tradition rather than difficult labor. Readers in New York and Boston will see Miguel's hands and imagine a simpler, more authentic way of life, never thinking about the aching back, the stained lungs, the weekly struggle to make wages stretch across family needs. But Miguel doesn't resent this. He understands that the romance sells cigars, and selling cigars keeps him employed. The reality and the image are two different things, and both serve their purposes. As the day draws toward its close, Miguel finds himself reflecting on the entirety of his life in tobacco. 23 years at this bench. Hundreds of thousands of cigars. His father before him, his grandfather before that. Soon Carlos will join this lineage, and perhaps one day Carlos's son will do the same. The tradition perpetuates itself, passing from generation to generation like a living inheritance. Is this good or bad? Miguel no longer tries to answer such questions. It simply is. This is the life available to him, the life he's made within the constraints of his circumstances. He's provided for his family, maintained his dignity, mastered a difficult craft. By the measures available to him, he's succeeded. At 7 o'clock, the bell rings its final note of the day. The rollers set down their tools, cover their tobacco, begin their evening rituals. Miguel cleans his chaveta with particular care, knowing that tomorrow he'll use it to create more presidential cigars, that his work will be boxed in cedar and mahogany, presented to powerful strangers, consumed in distant rooms where decisions affecting millions are made. He walks out into the evening with the other workers, joining the stream of tired men flowing from factory gates across Havana. The city is alive with end-of-day energy, vendors selling their final goods at reduced prices, families gathering for evening meals, the particular quality of light that comes just before full darkness. Tomorrow will be Tuesday, then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Saturday will bring wages again. Sunday will bring rest. And then it begins once more, the eternal cycle of labor and rest, work and wages, the slow accumulation of days that constitute a life. Miguel thinks about Carlos, about the observation period beginning next month. He'll teach his son what his father taught him, not just the techniques of rolling, but the deeper lessons. Work with care, no matter who receives credit. Take pride in craft itself, not in recognition. Provide for your family with honest labor. These are simple principles, perhaps insufficient for changing the world, but adequate for living with dignity within it. The sky deepens to purple, stars beginning their nightly appearance. Miguel turns onto his street and sees his home ahead, the light in the window, his family waiting. Elena will run to greet him. Rosa will have kept dinner warm. Jorge will be studying, Carlos reading his tobacco manual. The evening will unfold in its familiar pattern, and Miguel will be grateful for it, grateful for this small piece of the world that belongs to him. He's a cigar roller. His hands are stained, his back aches, his lungs carry the burden of decades breathing tobacco dust. He'll never be wealthy, never be famous, never escape the constraints of working-class life in 1920s Cuba. But he's mastered a craft, provided for those he loves, lived with honor within the circumstances he was given. Tomorrow, his hands will shape tobacco into perfect cylinders. They'll perform the ancient dance of filler, binder, wrapper. They'll create beauty that exists briefly before dissolving into smoke and memory. And that will be enough. It has to be enough. Because this is the life he has. And within its boundaries, he's found something approaching contentment, not happiness, perhaps, but something deeper. Purpose. Dignity. The quiet satisfaction of work done well. The week continues. The cigars accumulate. The tradition perpetuates itself. And somewhere in the darkness, tobacco plants grow in distant fields, their leaves reaching toward the sun, waiting for the harvest that will bring them to workshops and benches and skilled hands that will transform them into art. The cycle continues, as it always has, as perhaps it always will.